All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the meetup. Martin, go ahead and take over whenever you are ready.
Yeah, hey folks. I've got a little bit of a cold. I was telling Callie, so if I mute or like drink some water or something, I'm not like lagging out. I'm just trying to get my cough under control or something like that. So and I think Callie, you normally take questions and stuff sort of as people go along, right?
It's really up
Um,
to you on how you prefer, but yeah, that's, I think, typically what we go with. Is that okay?
Awesome. Yeah, that's totally great. If folks want to like raise a hand or drop a comment in the chat or whatever, I'll stop where I am and I'll take some like long breathing pause in case somebody wants to jump in too. Um but yeah, so I was chatting with Callie about like what would be an interesting topic, and one that came up that we were talking about was like what is SRE or site reliability engineering? And I think it's kind of funny because it's one of those things that even people's families and friends and people I know, they're like, what do you do again? And it's not something that they've often heard of. So I think tonight this is not like some super uh in the weeds presentation, but it's more like what is this? Where did it come from? Maybe a little bit of history and kind of what it is. But I geared it a lot towards like if it's for you to be able to see if it's something you might want to do. So if you're somebody who's like just getting into tech, or you've been there a while, like that's the audience I was going for. It was like, is this something that you would be interested in? Um, and so I'll start with a little bit of a bio. I don't normally kind of put almost a resume on a slide, but I actually think it's interesting because we're talking about SRE as a job, that like you kind of see the things I've done. So I'm a principal SRE at HashiCorp. We make software that people use to provision things in the cloud, to do security and encryption and service discovery and all these different kind of cloudy things that we build. I was a staff SRE there, and when I joined, I was a senior SRE too. I've held some other roles, and I think they're interesting for like if you're wondering what the background of people doing SRE is.
A hundred
So
percent.
yeah, exactly. So like I've been a principal engineer that's done like more full stack. I'm like just I know just enough React to like get in trouble for not matching the correct style of the rest of the page when I
I love
make a
that.
change. And I've been a sysadmin, so like that's a job maybe people have heard of a little bit more. Um, it's a little more old school, and I've also been a DBA, a developer. I've been like a software engineer. I actually did my first like job before I got a computer science degree, so I have a more traditional like education for this role. But SRE didn't exist when I was in school, and the school I went to didn't even like they focused on data structures, algorithms, things like they weren't doing things like how to build games or like the stuff that was sort of like cool. It was very foundational. And so even if SRE had been around, I don't think I would have been able to like learn it in school. Just kind of interesting. Um, but I have done a lot of other things, and I think that like that's something that's not uncommon for SREs, is that they've done a lot of other kinds of work. And so I think later in the presentation I'll come back to that, because I think in a lot of ways SRE is like, oh look, yep, formal full stack dev, right? I'm terrible at it, but they still employ me. Um, but I'll come back to this because I actually think in some ways like the skills you have, like the technologies and the things that you've learned over your career, are in some ways separate from what the role is. So first I want to talk about Agile. So like think back to 1990, there were like yeah, imagine, go the mall, Orange Julius, people with black light posters. Like this is a while ago now. I don't in my brain it was like 10 years ago, but it turns out it's actually more like 30.
Yeah, I didn't
This kind
actually
of
exist in 1990.
yeah. Well, so think about that era. For the longest time, people were making software, since the 70s, right? I think you had like electrical engineers building some of the first computers. You couldn't even get a computer science degree at a university in the 70s. And like by the 90s, like software was just sort of becoming its own thing. There were like starting to be like, I think the Palm Pilot was in the 90s, right? Um, and there was this movement in the 90s where for a long time, and I'm going to talk about this waterfall model on the left, which is when people made software, they like wrote down all the things it had to do. And then they were like, okay, what should it look like? And remember, this is not that detached from an era of like punch cards and mainframes and stuff. Like you had to know what you were going to be build in a lot of detail because like you didn't have a lot of opportunity to actually run your code. So like you spent a lot of time sort of preparing. And so by the time you got to the implementation step, yeah, you even learned about it in school. You really like had an idea what your product was going to be. It had to be so polished by the time you got to writing it and testing it. But in the 90s, a lot of folks were like, geez, this is so rigid. Like the so much is happening, so many things are changing so quickly. This is really slow. And computers were getting smaller and cheaper and all of those things too, you know, about those. But but yeah, it was like a you sort of like did all these steps, you build the product, you test the software, you fix the bugs, and then you're like, it's there, I launched it. You probably wrote it on floppy disks. Maybe if it was a late 90s, you put it on a CD and you like literally put it on a shelf somewhere. I mean, just not how we do software anymore at all. But people were realizing that this was so slow. And so some folks got together that were in the software engineering field and wrote this thing that was called the Agile Manifesto. And this diagram on the right sort of represents a little bit about Agile and what that is. But the idea is that like they wanted fast to ship software faster. They wanted to like, you know, like what we do today. It's like you save, you run, you like ship, you deploy something 10 times a day, and like you're not really waiting for it to be feature complete, right? And so Agile was sort of this movement of like, all right, we're gonna like be faster. And so there's this Agile manifesto that these folks publish. And it goes like individuals over processes, like um, working software over comprehensive feature sets, customer collaboration over like long specification, and just constantly responding to change instead of these like long plans over weeks, months, or years, right? Like if you're Microsoft building Windows in the early, like late 90s, early 2000s, you were like, you writing a practical book before you built anything, right? And they're like, not anymore, right? So that's like the by 2000 that these folks got there and did that. And so let me see here. Oh, and I've got the some of the Agile Manifesto here on the slide on the left. So they got together, and you'll recognize that like what they're talking about here is kind of closer to the way we build software today. You never see software that's done anymore, right? Like it's always in, you know, like Gmail is famously beta for 10 years or whatever, right? So it turns out that the way we were doing some other things in the tech industry, we're also making this difficult. So imagine you're like really agile, you're building software all the time, you're moving into this model, and then it's like, oh, you got to go request a network. And somebody's like putting network switches somewhere, and then they're like installing the operating system, and all these things are still very slow. And so I think you'll see that like there was this need to have more automation. If you were going to build software like this, you couldn't be slow to deploy, right? And you've also like probably heard of continuous integration or continuous delivery. I don't know if how much you've covered that in the meetup before, but
I actually don't think
yeah.
anyone has, so maybe a
Oh,
good.
okay. Maybe a good follow-up topic.
Yeah.
But the idea is like you're basically using as much automation as possible to ship changes as quickly as possible. So your website's constantly changing, or the app you're building is constantly changing, or um, and you sort of needed that to be able to have an agile model work well. And so Agile kind of bled a little bit into some of the not software development world, like systems administration, right? So maybe you've heard of sysadmins. I think I mentioned I had that title a couple different times. But like I worked somewhere in the early 2000s that had mainframes still. And like every other week they would fail over from one part of the mainframe to the other and then install software on the inactive partition. And that was in the 2000s, right? And if you were building, like I worked at a university, they had software that you could like log in and see your courses, that you would like ask the network folks for IP addresses, and then they'd give you the IPs, and then you go, okay, I've got to install the servers, and then you do that, and you make architecture diagrams, and then you like start installing software on it, and it's all very slow. This world of systems administration as well, and so that really did have to change for this agile movement, as I was saying, and so this thing called DevOps showed up, right? And so the idea with DevOps is that like there aren't just the network people and just the software people and the sysadmins are in one corner. The idea is like it's much more focused on breaking down silos and process and all of these kinds of things. And so I think it's interesting because this is the diagram you see all the time for DevOps. It was kind of born in the late 2000s, I guess the late noughts. So like 2009 was the first DevOps conference, DevOps days. And the idea is that, oh yeah, there's awesome. So Callie put a link to information about DevOps. So basically, at its simplest, it was about removing silos, as I said. So not just the people writing the code and the people maintaining the code. Like before this, I was on call for code I didn't write, right? Like someone else wrote it, and then I had to make sure it was running, and I would like restart it if it broke, and I would monitor it, but I wasn't the one making that software. And
What
so I think
what was the feelings of like the sysadmins and the developers like at the time that these ideas were coming out? Was this like, oh my gosh, this is such a great idea, like let's embrace it? Or was it like, oh my God, this is like, I know how to do my job, stop telling me what to do? You know what I mean?
honestly, it was like they didn't like each other, right? Like it was like your software woke me up 6 times last night, and like it's your software, and then the developers are like, well, your server needs more resources, and it was very much like, you know, they were competing with each other, really. Like it was like that was the mode at the time, and then DevOps was like, no, your boss, like if you worked somewhere that was trying to go through this transformation, like the guy that did the networking and the woman that wrote the software like had the same manager. And so it's like you could no longer afford to like point fingers across the
Oh, that's
organization. It was like, no,
awkward. Yeah.
you're all on one team, and like every team has networking engineers, but like DevOps also kind of expected the developers to know about that part as well. Like, they expected the sysadmins to be able to write code, which was not the case before, like either. And so, yeah, breaking down that silo of like these tight roles was this movement in DevOps that happened in the like late 2000 knots or whatever you want to call that. And everyone was just, like encouraged to develop skills in your career that were like not just a single function. You didn't have like the person that only knew Cisco networking anymore, right? Like that wasn't a thing. Um, but so you can kind of see over the last 30 years that like people started to ship software faster, and then they kind of applied that to systems administration next. And DevOps is what you call that. And then I think I've got a definition of DevOps. It's much more about being a philosophy than particular tools. Um, but people say that SRE could be considered an implementation of DevOps. So SRE, the first SREs existed as a team in 2003. But this is something I think it's really important to remember, is that site reliability engineering was something people were doing and they named it after, right? So there were like people who were like, DevOps, we like DevOps, DevOps is the way. And then they suddenly 10 years later looked around and said, I guess we should call this something specific because it's not like generic DevOps. Like and they named their team Site Reliability at Google. And so that's where that name came from. And by 2016, Google had more than 1,000 SREs,
Oh,
more than
wow.
1,000 site reliability engineers. But really their first team was in 2003. So you can kind of see DevOps is kind of evolving, and then they're like adopting practices as DevOps develops. They're like borrowing things from it and implementing it. And I want to make one other distinction, which is the SRE is like a job title, whereas DevOps was a whole philosophy, right? So um, SRE is basically Google's way of saying, we think in order to break down those silos, here's the things we should do. And SRE was less focused on the cultural aspects and more was like, here's the things you do, the practices you do. SRE is often referred to as practice. Um, and Google basically said, we think uh, SRE implements DevOps. That was a thing from Google. And Google is obviously not the only place that has SREs, but it's definitely kind of where that idea came from. There's some problems with this too, I'll talk about in a little bit.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so like just software, excuse me, site reliability engineering, what is it? Kind of is taking all those operations things that sysadmins and network engineers and all the other roles used to do and treat them like any other software problem, right? So um, also these other two ideas emerged, managing, like doing data-driven development and deciding what to work on in a data-driven way with these things called SLOs, which is really just measuring like how something is doing and then using that to decide what to work on next at a simple level. Um, and also, I think this is interesting that this came at the same time, but this idea that there's a thing called toil, which is like work that brings no value to the customers, and we should minimize that. So in some ways, there's a little bit of cultural or philosophy in there in the SRE world of like get rid of toil. And so I think I mentioned it already, but there's if you go to sre.google, there's like the first book they published on it is there. It's you can actually download it. It's free. You could read. Oh, look at that. Callie's got copies,
And the
multiple copies
workbook
of it. Oh,
too.
and a workbook. Yep, they've got the workbook they've also published. Awesome. Um, and there's a lot more that it goes into in terms of what they've done. There's also like people, like this isn't that long ago either. So you can actually find people, conference talks, other things people have written talking about like, well, we said in the book that that's what we do, but there were these challenges with it. So
Oh,
it's
cool.
SRE is still a conversation that's evolving, I think, in terms of what it can be. We actually have folks at HashiCorp that worked at Google around this time who have said there's things that Google stopped doing as well that aren't published yet, but you can actually hear about that they're like, oh, we don't actually that didn't work as well as we thought, right? So ongoing conversation. Um, and there's also this point that you may have heard, which is like Google is a particular company and what works for them may not be what works for your company or your employer or what you're doing. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that SRE can really mean different things at different places. I'll tell you, when I've interviewed somewhere, my one of my questions is like, what do you think SRE is? So just make sure I'm like aligned with what that definition is, and that I'll go back to that in a little bit because I think also it's become a little trendy. And so there's also people calling things like, yes, we do SRE, and it's like, well, maybe you're more of a sysadmin role actually, right?
Actually,
It's
funny you
kind of
say that because when I was interviewing for my job at HashiCorp, I like talked to my former boss and we were using analytics, and I was like, "Yeah, it's like this site reliability engineering role," and he's like, "Well, that could be real SRE work or that could be fake." He's like, "Make sure to ask
right.
questions." He's like, "Because it's a trendy thing to say SRE right now."
It really is, and people want the job title. So yeah, totally. And I actually have some comments later in this deck, which I guess I'm a little over halfway through, but I think it's also important just to look at the words. So the idea site, right, holistic, you're looking at the entire application, not focused on one particular area. Reliability, which has a bunch of distinctions people make about different kinds of reliability. So reliability is a catch-all. Whenever someone tells me they have an SRE role, one thing I'll do is like Command F and I'll look for the word reliability in the description, see is it there? And and there's like this idea about resilience, availability. Some people put security as a type of reliability, trust as a type of reliability. So like also the boundaries are kind of fuzzy as well on the word reliability. Um, and then this last point, which is that it really is a software engineering discipline. You will definitely find that there are SRE roles that are not, and like Callie said, I would say that's like, is it really SRE at that point, or are they just using the title? So many shades of gray. I think it's only natural to look at Google's ideas, and they've got some blog posts as well about how they've seen SRE evolve at Google. And I think what's interesting to note here is there's multiple kinds of teams even at Google, even for folks that are like SRE is the way. They've got teams that do different things, different job tasks. So I think that's kind of interesting. I've dumped some of them here in the slide just for folks to see that if you're curious. But they talk about like the kitchen sink team, which is like everything. And then there's teams that do infrastructure, teams that only do developer tools. There's teams that embed in other teams. And what I take away from this is that there's like a very subtle distinction between a team that does SRE for, say, infrastructure and SRE for tooling, like hopefully they're all using the same sorts of principles to increase reliability, but the software they're working on is really different. And sometimes there's a gray area there, right? Like if you have somebody building infrastructure and then making it reliable, are they an SRE? Or are they an infrastructure engineer that then also does SRE? And so there's feels like there's a lot of gray area in our industry around this. But I would say like when I put some observations on the right, which is like they're all sort of things that used to be traditional ops teams. So they're all things that used to be sysadmins and network engineers. They're all areas where they're like the name of it is the focus of the team. It doesn't tell you how to get there, right? The reliability for infrastructure might be really different than the reliability for a application you're writing. Um, Maybe you're using some similar techniques, but they're really different. You're working on different things. There's always some idea about governance in the SRE role. So it's like helping you, telling you what to work on as much as it is telling you like what techniques to use. It's like, it's telling you like that maybe you're going to use this input or this metric to decide what to work on, which could be really different again for like a product team versus an infrastructure team. And then there's one extra little point I want to make, which is that um, there's a lot of variation in SRE for ownership. And what I mean by ownership is you have teams that write software and then they hand it over to the SREs and the SREs run it. And they might even rewrite it. They might change the programming language, or they might like rewrite it to be more increased performance, or they might rewrite it to
That's
make
cool.
it, yeah, like they might run it in different regions, or they might make it clusterable, but they never change the like features, right? And then there's other models where you have SREs that are like sometimes dipping their toe in development. So like in a lot of ways, they're software developers just like the other software developers, but like their focus and their goals are different. You even have teams where like it's half SRE and half software devs, and they're like in one sprint or like one planning cycle, they're like building the things they care about into the software at the same time. Um, so
Would
I just
you
wanted to give people a little bit of a view of what these things could be.
definitely, how would you, so a lot of the coding with Callie community is like more like beginning level, trying to break into tech. So like a lot of these devs are working on like portfolio projects. So what are some ways that you can incorporate like reliability and like, I don't know, I guess like the DevOps philosophy into your personal projects?
Yeah, I would say like go back to that point about automation, right? Like um maybe you're working on, I know you all have an app that you're like continuously iterating on. Maybe you maybe you add a script to your repository that automatically like creates a virtual machine and deploys your app into it and then like runs tests against it or something, right? Like maybe think about automation, go back to that point about automation being required to be more agile and build some automation. I think that could be a way. Um, I also think like there's more than just this list on the left. So like I think you could potentially like there's teams that do observability, right? And like so maybe you could think about like adding some observability into your project and then like making a graph so that you can see over time like how is it running. Okay, so those are some things I could suggest.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I have some other suggestions I think in here too. So like, but what do SREs actually do is what I wanted to talk about a little bit. Um, and so I think like this is another thing that I'm always interested in when companies tell me they do SRE is like, what types of activities do you do? Like, what does a day look like for you? If you're thinking about getting into this role, um, you might want to be good at sort of consultation. You might want to be like able to easily ask some questions and make a recommendation. This is actually like a classic job interview question I use sometimes. Like, I come to you and I need to know whether I should build this new thing in Golang or in Ruby or whatever. And I'm like, tell me, like, what questions would you ask me? Right. And you
Cool.
can get a lot of information from people when if about what they know, if they can compare those two choices. Um, but so like, if you want to put your head down and write features, that SRE may also not be for you. Like, it really is one where you're winning the hearts and the minds of people when you're trying to talk to them about what they should do next. So if you're not interested in that, maybe you want to be a more pure software developer where you can have a little more focus. Um, this is another one that I think is really interesting. Is sometimes SRE, you end up working on things like incident management, and so you might be like improving that, or like I mentioned before, if you're helping a team measure how software is performing, you're gonna have to come up with like, what do you do when it's not performing well? So like, SRE really leans on a lot of different skills to do these kinds of things. So there are SREs out there that are like, oh, I want to write code. I don't want to do process work, but sometimes that shows up, right? Or sometimes process work then is supported by software projects. So um, yeah, it's definitely something where process comes in big. And I don't think that's probably true of software development jobs too, but I think it's different. You know, an incident is really different than like a planning process when you're working on those. Like, you can improve planning and it's a lot less, hopefully a lot less stressful than fixing an incident. Um, so that's another thing. A lot of SRE teams also just collaborate. They put like a software developer and an SRE and an infrastructure engineer. Again, back to the sort of DevOps model. They like just, you're on a collaborative team and you're building something together. And I have some examples in here. Like, maybe you're doing rate limiting on and so you don't want a million requests to knock down your app you're building. And so like, everybody from the networking person to the SRE to the software developer has to be involved to like figure out how to design and build that. Um, Also embedding, I think this is really interesting. A lot of SRE jobs I see do this now. And embedding is not easy, but so what embedding is like, you have a software dev team that has like, I don't know, 10 engineers and you have one SRE, and you like go and you work with that team. Hopefully you have two so that you're not alone. But sometimes it's just
That sounds
you.
scary.
Yeah, and it is scary. And it also requires that you like speak up a lot, right? It requires that you
Mhm.
advocate for the reliability work that you're doing because you're outnumbered. And so I think this is one where like, if you're not super comfortable being self-directed and like pushing on a little bit on the team, embedding is really hard.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd actually love to at some point, we don't have to talk about it now, but like talk about like the personality traits or maybe like characteristics or like goals of someone who would be good for this role, even if they aren't at a point where like they know what they like in this realm yet. If
Right,
that makes
right.
sense.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. I mean, I talked about some with embedding where it's like, you have to sort of be outgoing. You have to like speak up. You have to like challenge ideas, right? Like, as I mentioned, like, I have a principal SRE role. Like, I have to challenge the VP of engineering sometimes. That's like not fun, right? Sometimes I have to be like, I hear you that you always know when there's an outage, but then you had one yesterday where you didn't know. So maybe we don't actually know when your software is always up. That's like very hard.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
yeah, and I think also being self-directed as a learner is really important for this one because, and I'll come to this later too, but a lot of times, like, you're approaching a project that already exists that you don't know anything about, right? So somebody's like, tell me how to make this, like, instrument this code. And you're like, I've never seen this project before in my life. Like, I'm not sure how to instrument this code. Let me look at it with you, you know? And so you have to be able to like, do that. I think another one is iteration. You have to be really comfortable with iteration in these roles because, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, as they say. Like, as an SRE, you're not trying to make people 100% reliable all the time. You're trying to bring them you're like every 1% that your uptime you fought for. Like, so you have to be comfortable with that. And what works to get you from 80% online to 90% available might be different than what gets you to 100. Um, and then I think this is the last one I think of these kinds of slides, but I also wanted to mention that sometimes SRE teams and engineers actually build stuff themselves, right? So, one that I think of a lot is like auto scaling, or and auto scaling is this idea that like when more requests come in, you provision more resources, right? This is like you make mugs and then tomorrow you're on Oprah and Oprah's viewers try to hit your website and nobody can buy a mug. And so you need to be sure that like as more requests come in, you build more servers or provision more capacity. And then you don't want to pay for that when Oprah's show ends. It's great that you're on Oprah, but you don't want to always be ready for 200,000 visitors. And so like you want to get rid of that capacity and not pay for it anymore. So that's like an example of something that an SRE team might actually just build out of whole cloth. That's writing code, but it's not code for an application. So that's just one example. But I think sometimes SREs also sort of, as I mentioned before, can parachute into a project and they might write code directly in the project. You might find a bug, right? And you might go, oh, more than 10 requests a second, like I sometimes I get the wrong cookie or whatever, and you're like, okay, I've got to fix that. So sometimes SREs really own stuff from top to bottom, like as far as software they've built.
How do
Um,
you, when you're interviewing for an SRE position, kind of like try to figure out what type of role you would be getting and if that would be a good fit for you?
that's a great question. I mean, I think one thing again, asking about the SRE model, right? And then also asking like, how do you engage with customers? Like, do you embed? Like embedding is so classic. So like just ask, like, do you embed in other teams? Like at the most SREs I've ever seen leave the profession, it's almost like so many of them, it's after embedding because they're like alone, they're on another team and they're like freaked out and they're like, I came here because I wanted to work with this team, but I'm on this other team, right? So I would say like ask about the projects, also ask about the roadmap for the team. Be like, are is every team like working towards the same thing, or are they all like kind of on their own little worlds, right? So like, is the team that owns software also aware of the team that's embedding? Like, and are they like talking to each other? Are they like sharing requirements? So I think it's just like asking like, how do you work? How do you decide what to work on? How, if there's more than one SRE team, like, are they all working towards the same goal or not? I think those are questions I would ask. Um, and sometimes you don't get that from a director or a leader that you're talking to. So like, it's really interesting to ask an engineer who joined like 3 months before you interviewed, like, do you think all the teams are working on the same thing? And they may have a very different answer. So you might have to ask this. Sometimes it's interesting to ask that to everybody you talk to on an interview loop. Like if you're talking to
Oh, yeah.
different people, like see what they all say, right? And I've done that, and sometimes they all have different answers, and you're like, and then you talk to a manager or a director, and they're like, oh yeah, not all the teams know, but we are working towards the same thing, but they aren't all aware of it. And like that's really interesting. That tells you what kind of communication you're going to see in the organization. Um, but yeah, asking about projects, asking about how they pick what to work on, and asking about roadmap are ways I would think. Um, so I wanted to go back to the beginning a little bit. But sorry, did you have
No, I
something
was,
else?
I thought that was a great answer. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I wanted to go back to the beginning a little bit, like, and I mentioned like I kind of walked through my resume, right, a little bit. And so I want to say like nothing I've told you tells you what to go study to be an SRE, right? Like, so I put on the left side, like, here's some areas, some topics I think that it would be good for you to know. But what makes you a good SRE a lot of the time is the breadth of knowledge and the breadth of experience that you have. And so you actually see a lot of developers become SREs later, or even people bounce between that role. They do a little bit of being a software developer for a few years, and then they go be an SRE for a few years, and then they go back to being a software and back to SRE. Um, you also like they don't all have to have the same experience either, which I think is interesting. So like I put operating systems on this list. You probably should know some stuff about operating systems, even just to be a developer, but you don't have to know about Windows or only about Linux or only about Mac. I think just knowing about one of those can make you a good SRE. But the idea is like you walk into these unknown situations a lot of the time and you have to figure out how to make it better than when you started when you got there, right? Like you're just improving it from where it was, making it a little more reliable, a little bit more measurable. And so your breadth of experience is really valuable for that. So um, I think I told you all like I was a DBA really early in my career. So like I have some experience with MySQL and Microsoft SQL Server. Do I use those directly day to day? No. But like as an SRE, if I notice an application is having problems and I can see that it's hung on the database, I know enough to log into the database to see whether there's too many connections or whether there's a query that's been running for a long time, but I'm not like writing queries all day. Um, and so I think these are some areas on the left that you could study if you wanted to like have some kind of learning path towards SRE. Um, Same thing with other experience I've had, right? Like I've worked in real-time C environments. I was a Java developer at one point. Do I ever write Java? No, but like it taught me a lot that I can use to troubleshoot now. And on the right-hand side, I put some things that I think are like more, they're not really like things you should go learn or study, but they're like areas that are really useful for SREs. So like, for example, if you've seen Rails and you've also seen PHP apps and you've also seen the React world and Node.js, like knowing different architectures can be really useful because sometimes that's the answer to solving a problem is like changing the architecture of an application slightly or adding a caching layer, right? Like um, if you do Rails, you know about caching because you've seen caching all over the place in Rails. But like if you're working on something that's not Rails, that's like a really useful play to know in your head that that's an option. So learning about different architectures is useful. Service discovery, not the most popular thing I think for architectures, but it's like useful to know how traffic goes through systems. How does a user request go through a system? Useful to know about multiple ways that could happen. That'll teach you about load balancers and also about proxies, right? Like the load balancers and proxies are like two different things that can fill a very similar niche in an architecture. Like good to have seen that before. So it's like almost like a lot of this is stuff that it would be good for you to have seen. Um, but like very much I'll say like if I'm looking at an SRE role and they do Rails, like it may be that I'm not a great fit if I don't do a lot of Rails. I haven't worked with Rails, but it also may be that some teams are like, no, actually bring the information you learned with backend Node.js and Express APIs to our Rails shop, and like that makes you a stronger person, like for them. So that's something to ask if you're ever like talking to somebody about an SRE role is like, how important is it that I know this technology versus I have a good like breadth of technology? Um, and again, performance optimization, troubleshooting, and distributed systems are also like really popular areas, right? I think for me, troubleshooting and debugging is like one of the biggest ones as an SRE that is useful to know. And again, it's not that you know how to troubleshoot, like it's not that you know how to send a Java virtual machine an OS signal to dump its memory core. It's that you understand like the strategies, right? So like I can't tell you how many times I've done a debugging or troubleshooting interview and nobody ever mentions like try to reproduce it, right? They're always like, first I'd look at the configs and then I'd look at the logs and then I'd look at this and that. And I'm like, maybe it's not even really a problem. Like I try to reproduce it, right? So it's like having a strategy for that can make you a really
How
effective
annoying is
SRE.
that when you got a bug and you like literally can't reproduce it and then it just falls
Right,
into
right.
sleep?
No, it drives me mad, but at least it's something that like you should do. So I have just a little bit left about SRE. So help, I think I might be interested in being an SRE.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah. So is SRE harder than a software developer job? Like I said before, I think it's just a different focus. You use a lot of the same skills. And by the way, like having been an SRE might make you a really good software developer too. So I think these are all complementary. Um, it's a pretty well paying job. I think I looked today when I pulled these numbers and that was like the average salary is like 130 in the US. If you're a US based person, that's pretty good. But the median is even a lot higher. And like 10% of people in SRE make more than almost $350,000. Like that's pretty good. They're very valuable positions for companies. So if you're thinking about going into that, like it's super valuable for companies to have. It often means they don't have enough of them too. Um, so let's see what else. I think if you think about reliability as just another thing that customers care about, like that's a great approach. If you want to write software as an SRE, that's like what you should expect. So, as I mentioned earlier, like you will find jobs that are really infrastructure engineer or sysadmin jobs that people call SRE because it's trendy. But if you find they're not writing software or you don't want to write software, which is fine, there's a lot of really valuable roles that don't write software too. Like, but SRE is probably not what you want. Um, and like really another core tenet of SRE is like the teams that will build better systems if they're closer to the operation of those systems, right? If you get woken up at 2 a.m. 5 times in a week, you're much more likely to fix that bug, whether it's the priority of the team or not. So that's like sort of an SRE approach is like the people that you have to have control and the ability to modify and fix the thing you own. Um, if you're in that field. It can't be a kind of thing like the pre-DevOps before DevOps where you'd like throw it over the wall. You keep making tickets for the other team and they never fix the bug and you keep getting woken up. Like
Oof.
that's not really an SRE model. Um, Also, I think I touched on this a little bit, but there's a lot of data-driven decision making in the SRE role. So like if you're into that, you're into measurement, you're into being curious, like
Can
SRE is
you
a great
do a
fit.
brief overview about what SLIs, SLOs, SLAs, and air budgets are?
Yeah, sure.
You can do that briefly.
No problem. It's a good interview question actually for people too. So, um, the idea is these three abbreviations. So SLI is service level indicator, SLO is service level objective, and SLA is service level agreement. So you can kind of think of like, um, let's see, imagine you're driving a car. Like I'm just going to use that as an example. An SLI for the car might be it's going 60 miles an hour, right? And an SLO might be it has to at least be running at 50 miles an hour or faster all the time. So like if it can't get to that, you're not meeting your objective. So the indicator says 60 miles an hour, the objective is 50. And SLA is the car company promising you that the car can go at least 50 miles an hour. It's the agreement, it's the contract. And if you ever encounter this in the tech industry, like in the real world, it's usually that they're going to not charge or they're going to give money back or they're going to pay customers if they don't meet that agreement. So like the idea is like you have to do this thing 90% of the time. It's going to respond within 1 second. And if it doesn't, like you owe me money or you give me a discount on the service you're providing me. And then error budgets is that distance between whether you're meeting the agreement or not. So it might be like you promise that 28 days out of 30, the car is going to go at least 50 miles an hour. Um, and so far, you're 10 days into the month and it's gone at least 50 miles an hour all those 10 days. You have like 18 more days or something, right? Where you can, there's still like maybe 2 days where the car can break and you're still within your agreement. That's the error budget. It's like, um, and so actually SREs help companies and organizations make decisions, based on how much error budget they have left. So it can actually be really empowering. You could actually, I don't know if anybody here is working in tech has seen like the site can't be down. We can't have it be down. And it's like, no, actually, if our agreement is that it's up 99% of the time, then in a month, like that 1% is actually like, well, let's just bring it down and do maintenance. Like you actually don't have to worry about it being down.
Yeah, I
Did
love
I
the idea of
hit
like it
that?
can help you plan what you're gonna do like moving forward, whether you can do a new feature, whether you need to like kind of lock things down for a while, like a
Right,
full model.
right. So it can help you make decisions.
Awesome. Thanks for the
Um,
information.
yeah, sure. There's also some downsides, right? Like I mentioned, some roles may be less technical. So you might find that there's an SRE role that is just 100% incident management. Uh, that may not be to your liking. You might not want to do just run incidents all day. hopefully they let you build some software because that sort of SRE ethos is using software to solve problems. So maybe some automation will help you with incidents, but you don't always get to be building software or in a technical role. And so, and that brings me to that SRE titles are sometimes wrong. Like there are definitely people in roles I would call support. Um, and as I mentioned, there's other like SRE as a field, like it's hard to staff them, it's hard to hire them. Often they're driving cultural change in organizations. Like that's really hard. So um if you're not like wanting to drive cultural change in organizations, something to interview for as an SRE. Like if they don't believe reliability is important and you're not ready to make some cultural change, that's going to be a really hard role for you. Um, and yeah, just some like comments. I know I've talked for way too long, but
You're doing
um,
great.
okay, I know we have about an hour, right? So this is my like last slide. Um, so some things that are coming in the future, because as I mentioned, I think I said this, but SRE didn't exist when I was in school anyway. And so like probably if you're applying for SRE jobs today, they're really different than the ones of even 5 years ago as technology's changed. Tools around things like we talked about SLI, SLO, SLA. There's now like software that helps you manage that. So SRE is changing a lot, but um, I think you'll find like here's some of my predictions for the future of what SRE could look like or what I see coming. So the tech job market's been a lot worse in the last year, just following along certain kinds of moves in the larger stock market and economy. So you actually see less SRE jobs because they tend to be so high paying and so impactful. So I think like that will impact how you see SRE in the future. Would not surprise me to see companies hire people in roles that they don't call SRE because it's cheaper to do so. Um, you also see this is really cool. Callie and I work with somebody who has a master's degree in this, but you see like the idea of reliability starting to like learn things from other industries. So that's been really cool, right? Like the airplane industry, the sort of nautical safety, shipping world, um, all of those things, right? We've probably all seen the sort of Boeing drama in the news. Like there are people building software that are learning from the problems that Boeing has
Yeah,
had. So
that was
you're starting to
actually
see
our
that.
last book club reading was
Oh,
all about the aviation industry and safety in it and what they've learned.
yeah, and like
Liability.
nuclear power, another big one, right? So I think SRE is like borrowing more from those. I think you'll see that increase. Um, there's also this idea of resilience engineering that's getting really popular in SREs. So if this sounds exciting to you, you might be interested in SRE. But the idea here is that instead of optimizing to prevent failure, you make people really good at responding to failure.
Oh,
That
cool.
doesn't work as well in like aviation, right? You're like, okay, the plane is crashing. How do we do that better? But like, there are things, right? And I think this is true for incident response in software. So like, your software is gonna go down at some point. It's never 100% available. Like, how do you make your team better at bringing it back or understanding what's happening? Um, there's also platform engineering is this discipline that's sort of shown up really in the last 5 years even. Um, and the idea is that like instead of going to a team and helping them make their software better, you're like giving them more like pre-chewed or like already contained solutions. So you're like, hey, if you deploy on my blah blah blah, then like you get an SLO for free, or you get, replication for free. Or so it's like SREs are building more things that are like services they're offering to people building software. So
Meta.
they're like, that's the big thing that's happening right now. You see this with observability. I know, Callie, you work on a lot of things that are like sort of canned solutions around observability that developers can just like get for free and use, and their lives are better and their software's more reliable. But like, you never embed it in every team to tell them what to do, you know?
No, thank goodness.
Um, right. And the last one, I'll just say like AI can't predict any future thing without mentioning AI. But you are starting to see like SREs think about AI because they deal with a lot of data-driven decision making, and AIs are really good at just like finding stuff in data for you, right? So also for like incident response, like what's broken, troubleshooting, doing things really quickly that would take a lot of commands to type by hand, like you're starting to see AI show up a little bit more in SRE. But That's like everything that I had to say about SRE, maybe too much. But feel free to add me on LinkedIn or like send me an email or something if you want to talk more about any of these.
Yay, thank you so much.
And
That
that's
was
it.
so great. Let's open the floor up for questions. We've got 9 minutes. So does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Martin?
Maybe something that didn't make sense. I'm happy to like go deeper into any of those too.
You can put it in the chat if you're feeling shy as well. But also don't worry because I always have more questions.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to formulate a question. Hi, Martin. Hi, Callie.
Hey,
Hey,
But
you can
Martin,
ask.
I'm a software engineer by trade, and I recently just transferred over to the SRE team at work. And
congrats.
thanks. It has absolutely been a blast. I'm learning every day. I'm just having a lot of fun. Um, One of the things that I've been thinking about is how I can support my team better. Um, all of them are well, my entire team is more like operational based, right? So they
Mm,
support the organization in monitoring, when the response time in the application starts to kind of go down. Um, and like, the the expertise that I'm kind of bringing to the table is like being able to read memory dumps because our organization is .NET based. So like having that experience there, being able to look at code and provide feedback on that. And maybe even like one of the things that I've been talking about with like my manager is like developing things to help the team, kind of like becoming more like enablers. Any thoughts on any, potential things that you've tried that can help enable a team like that?
yeah, and when you say enable the team, you mean the SRE team, not the teams you're working with, right?
Yeah, kind of like
SRE team itself.
starting with the SRE team, and then we have ideas about helping other teams, but that comes later, right? You got to get buy-in from them.
Yeah, I mean, even this is like cultural change, which is hard. I mean, some suggestions I would have are like, um, it sounds like maybe not everybody on the team feels as comfortable developing software. That's not unusual on SRE teams. So like maybe you could look for something that the team could directly build and own to sort of build their own confidence, get more reps at some of the things you want the team to be able to do. Like if you're helping your development teams, like for example, you mentioned monitoring, like maybe there's a world where something that your team owns, you could work on improving the monitoring for and like get people the like skills or experience or like even just building like more empathy with the development teams can be really helpful. I think I think like I think it is really healthy for SRE teams to have their own projects that sort of continue to scratch that itch of writing software. Um, I'm not sure if I'm kind of reading between the lines on what the challenges are a little bit with your description. But I
We
think
are we are so like the team's never had, well, the team faces a challenge of production's broken or something's
mm,
not working, right? And they're like just shooting in the dark. And like over time they've kind of developed a lot of people that kind of just know the system well. And so like
oh,
when
that's
when when
typical.
like a client starts to go, well, I was doing this and it's starting to go slow, and they're like, I know what it is, right? And I'm like, how do you even like know that without being a software engineer, right? And they're like, yeah, I don't read code. I just know that there the problems here. And I'm like, today we were having a conversation about how do you narrow down the scope of the problem? You've got a web
Mm.
server and a database, right? Like, how do you start that conversation? Um,
Yeah, maybe a suggestion that would be interesting for you to try. It's going to sound really weird at first, but I promise it makes sense, which is, there's this idea that solving problems sometimes stops learning about them. And so there's this idea that like, if you have incidents with customers, like
mhm.
one thing that I really love is this idea of like maybe either splitting the meeting where you talk about what happened. Usually people have like a retro or an RCA or debrief or
Yeah.
something. Um, And usually as soon as somebody suggests an action item in that meeting, everyone else like erases that from their mind and goes like, okay, we've taken care of it. Like, um, the action item's going to be there. I don't have to think about this problem anymore, which actually hurts people's like ability to build knowledge about the systems they're working with. Like you said, like, how does this person know that? So, one thing you could do is actually split that into 2 meetings and have one just be about learning about the system. Like, and if you have to, like, have the meeting about action items first, although I think it's better to have it later, but if you have to, have it first just to get it out of the way, and then have a second debrief that is just like how did you know that? Like, teach me about this part of the system. Because sometimes that the finality of like that, like, okay, we fixed it, actually stops people's curiosity. um I don't know if that's like a helpful suggestion, but I think that's one that I've seen kind of like decouple learning from fixing and then spend deliberate time on both.
No, thank you. I
Yeah, yeah.
will, I'm gonna flip that idea with like my team and see what they think. Because a lot of the times, like you mentioned, they've been going so fast. I'm like, hey, can you pump the brakes? I have no idea how you got from point A to point B. Like, and they're like, yeah, this dashboard gets you here. And I'm like, sure, let's walk through that.
Yeah, is your team remote or are they like in an office?
So we're half and half. So I
Okay.
am remote. Most of them are right near the headquarters. But you know, they only go into the office like one day a week.
I think that there's something interesting there about strategy for this too, right? The difference between looking over someone's shoulder who has found a dashboard and someone remotely, like, is really
Yeah.
tricky. And so maybe there's also strategies I think like you could use where you like have the person remote be the person that's on call at that time. And if they're in the office, they're not on call or something. Like, there's things you could maybe think about splitting the strategy for learning in a way that like, or like build remote ways to look over someone's shoulder. Be like, I don't know if your organization has a lot of outages, but like I've been in places that do, and sometimes it's like, okay, we're gonna just hang out in this Zoom room because we know that there's gonna be opportunities to like just virtually look over someone's shoulder too. So maybe there are things you can do to like to bring the team a little closer together when they're fixing a problem as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
yeah,
it.
sure.
I'm kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum where like I knew nothing about SRE when I got hired. I'm honestly surprised that I got hired. And so like the biggest key for me getting up to speed has been like pair programming, but like pair debugging or pair observing. So it would like I legit schedule an hour a week with each of my team members. And it's called learning with whoever. And we just like go and explore a system. I spend the entire hour just asking questions about how it works. And it's like a really like low pressure, low stakes, because like we might look into like a past incident that's already like closed. So like there's no like pressure to like hurry up and solve this. Or we might just go look at logs or traces and see if we can like find something to solve. So I don't know if that would help, but like from the learner's perspective, like having that time has really helped.
Also, like, I tell this to some people that I've mentored that are like, how did you know that? Right? Since you use that language, I've had people say that to me, and I have to remind them that like I'm not any smarter than anyone else. I just happen to be around when that system was built. And so like I remember that, right? And so like that's something like I would never beat yourself up or like tell your colleagues not to beat themselves up if like they don't know that, or they're like, it's like, no, that's not, it sort of looks like magic, but it's really just the benefit of experience of having
Yeah.
been there.
No, it's you know, like I came in with like a title of lead, so they were expecting like a lot more, like the team was.
Mm-hmm.
And like when I started saying things like, how did you do that? I don't know what you're doing. And like my boss is like, keep saying things like that and being vulnerable, because the younger folks on the team, when they struggle, they're like, everybody else just knows their stuff. And the process is, well, how do you know if you don't ask questions? So like
Right.
that learning aspect is just phenomenal. And I think a lot of the younger people, right? Like they see the end result. Like when I'm developing, right? Like I get to leverage my 11 years of experience. So like I'm pretty good and pretty fast at it, right? And everyone else is like, well, I just graduated. I should be able to do that.
No.
Okay. I don't want to I wouldn't do that, because that is just shooting for a target that's not going to work. But learn to get there. And I think a lot of the younger folks on the team were really taken back with my lack of knowledge from like the operations side. So that's kind of, bridged a lot of, that's kind of, well, formed a lot of bridges. Because like they reach out now when they're like, hey, I just learned this really cool thing. And like vice versa. And I'm just like, what does this mean? Like, how did you figure that out? So
yeah, this like we're all in it together attitude is worth its
Yeah.
weight in gold, I think too. Cause like also interviewing tip, like admitting you don't know something is a thing a lot of interviews look for, but especially in SRE because you don't. There's just like nobody has all of it, right? Like so
yeah.
being able to say I don't know is like super valuable. Like it's a bummer to think that maybe there are people more early in their career that like don't want to speak up and they're all having to learn the same stuff separately, like when they could have done it together. Like
I think you're absolutely right. Like when I'm like mentoring junior software engineers, right? They want to skip like steps. And I'm like, why? Like there's no rush to be a senior. Like don't yes, the pay is nice, but the responsibility sometimes can suck. Right? Like
And you
take
have
your
to write
time.
things that aren't code, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
true.
The higher up you go, the less you guys know what I mean. And yeah, the juniors were just like, that's not how I was taught. I'm like, that's great. Show me how you do stuff. And they're like, well, you know more than me. And I'm like, wouldn't make that assumption. Let's just start there.
All the juniors want to be seniors, all the seniors want to go back to being juniors. Love it.
Well, I think that's
Absolutely.
actually a great place to end things. That is a very true statement. I think it is up there with the answer to any interview question is it depends.
Sure.
So yeah, thank you so much, Martin. Neil, thank you so much for stepping up with the question. I really appreciate that too. You can follow and reach out to Martin on LinkedIn, it sounds like, with more questions. And yeah, I'll see everybody hopefully in 2 weeks. I can find another speaker. Don't have one lined up. If anyone knows anyone or wants to volunteer, let me know.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks so much. Bye all.